Hi, I'm Angela O'Keefe and I'm the author of Night Blue. Night Blue is a novel about the Jackson Pollock painting Blue Poles, which was purchased by the National Gallery of Australia in 1973. It was pretty controversial at the time. It seemed like pretty much everyone in the country had an opinion about that purchase. I actually think that's a wonderful thing that in 1973 the whole country was talking about a painting. I'm just going to show you the inside cover, which is, of course, a reproduction of Blue Poles. The cover was designed by Peter Lowe, and I think it's just gorgeous. And I particularly love how it seems like the painting is actually holding the story. And in a sense, that is actually how I imagined the story as I was writing it. Now here's the first chapter, told in the voice of Blue Poles. I began one night in 1952 in a barn on Long Island, New York. Jackson unrolled a piece of Belgian linen, 5 meters by 3 onto the floor. He liked to work on the floor, to be able to walk around and around a painting, to feel like he was part of it, in it, he said. He left the canvas and went to the window, looked out to the darkness, breathed. It was raining. A cigarette between his lips, smoke floating out towards the rain. I don't know how long he stayed there. Minutes? Years. I was not yet colour, and time had not settled in me. He turned and made his long-limbed amble across the room, crouched before his tins of paint, prized one open. The smell of me. He stood over the canvas, angled the tin. Years later, I heard that another artist, a friend of Jackson's, had been there the night I began, that they wielded paint and ideas along with Jackson. But if they were there, I didn't notice them. I was only aware of Jackson, of his paint-spattered dungarees and the impulsive grace of his movements, and his gaze that sought me as one seeks a horizon to dream into, to orient oneself. There were layers of daze and frowning and sometimes laughter, and outside the rain came and went, and the smoke of his cigarette went out the window to it. He circled me, giving me drizzles of colour and particles of glass. He was like a bird fussing over its nest. When he left me alone, I watched the sky through the window turn from grey to blue to black. When he returned, the open door let in the smell of the marshes behind the barn. He moved around me, all elbows and knees, a gangly dance, by which he gave me not only colour and shape, but memories. The shadow of an ash tree from his Arizona childhood, a recurring dream in which he ran towards his mother's open arms, but never reached them. What his wife, Lee Krasner, once said to him at Penn Station, as they stood side by side, about to board a train, said not in words, but through the skin of her arm pressed to his, "We are silence, Jackson." His life gathered in his gestures gathered in me. One day he picked me up off the floor and tacked me to a high beam that ran against the back wall of the barn. Light slanted at new angles. My perspective shifted. Through the window, I saw the edge of a tree, a road, a shingle grey corner of a building. I supposed it was where Jackson lived. He applied paint with a brush, letting it drizzle down me in crooked lines. I hung there for days as the paint ran down me, through me, sometimes hurrying, sometimes meandering, like time itself. Then one morning he took me down from the beam and returned me to the floor. On the night he finished me, he stood looking at me for a long time. He reeked of alcohol, a smell I was used to by then. It was only later that I realised alcohol was not a human need like water or air. His eyes shone with a question. I couldn't tell what it was, yet it filled me with a wild hope. It seemed to hold out a promise. He left, the door closing, and I thought it was the last I would see of him that night. But he soon returned, carrying a long, straight piece of timber. He went to his paints and opened a tin, dark blue. He dipped the timber in the paint, then lay it sodden against me, over and over. His movements gained momentum. At one point he kicked off his boots and they sailed and thudded into a corner. He lay the timber against me, then away, against me, then away. His gestures had a strange calm, a kind of emptiness. There were no memories, no images, as I was used to. He had reached some end in himself, some end in me. I was part of Jackson's solo exhibition at Sydney Janus Gallery in New York later that year. People gathered with glasses of wine in hand. They stepped back to take in the entirety of me. They stepped forward to peer at particulars. One man said I looked like a burnt fence. A woman referred to me as a landscape, and another corrected her. Jackson Pollock doesn't paint landscapes. An inner landscape, then, the first woman persisted. A man told the story of a plumber living near Jackson who'd called his paintings messed up road maps. His companions laughed. You can see his point, one said. The show was not a triumph. Only one painting sold, not me. Afterwards, the reviews were in agreement. Jackson had reached the heights of his success a few years earlier when he'd appeared on the cover of Life magazine with the headline, Jackson Pollock, is he the greatest living painter in the United States? Though showing touches of brilliance, the show had failed to answer that question with a resounding yes. I only became aware of this much later, in the calm white room of the gallery in which I've hung for decades, on the other side of the world from where I began. A guide was telling my history to a group of tourists with red-stung cheeks and lank hair. There must have been a cold wind blowing off the lake outside, typical of Canberra in August. Or rather, the guide was telling my outer history. My inner history, I'm telling you. The day after the show, Jackson came into the gallery and he and Sydney Janus, the gallery owner, lifted me off the wall and laid me on the floor. Jackson leaned over me. His cheeks hung in narrow strips. I couldn't read his expression. He reached forward and ripped me from my frame, using such force that the nails that had held me in place flew like bullets to the edges of the room. Janus seemed surprised, turning his long, angular face from Jackson to the nails, spinning across the floor, and then to me. But he said nothing. Then together they rolled me up and carried me into a back room and left me next to a fire extinguisher, where I remained for many days. Eventually I was reframed and returned to the barn and leaned against the back wall. It was summer. The air was soft. Through the window the leaves were bright. Jackson brought a man and a woman to see me. They stood together, murmuring in the rays of dusty light. After they left, Jackson went on gazing at me, standing so close I could see the remnants of old paint embedded beneath his nails. At one point his eyes grew bright and I thought he might speak, not aloud but through his thoughts. But he turned from me and went to his tins of paints and then to a canvas that lay spread on the floor and began to move around it. Flicking colour from a thin brush, his gaze dreamy, intense. I watched him work all through that day and the next. I heard the soft thud of his boots and smelt the smoke of his cigarette. I heard him swear, laugh, cough. Once he paused to light a cigarette, his big hand sheltering the flame, and he looked my way. But I couldn't tell what he was thinking. His thoughts and his memories were closed to me.